Moscow. Autumn, 1963. The chill is metallic, seeping through a woolen coat. It carries the scent of damp stone and diesel fumes from the street below. Inside a safe house, the air is still, thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of a single lamp. Two men sit at a plain wooden table. One is a Soviet intelligence officer, his face a study in controlled expectation. His hands are steady on the tabletop. The other is an American. His posture is rigid, but his eyes dart to the small, heavy suitcase at his feet. He is Joseph E. Helmish, a United States Army sergeant. Just months ago, he was a communications specialist at a base in France. Now, he is here, in this room, on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. He slides a sealed canister across the table's polished surface. It is unremarkable, a dull metal cylinder, but its contents are a profound violation. Army's primary field communications systems. The officer's fingers close around the canister. There is no dramatic exchange, no spoken acknowledgement of the magnitude of the transaction, only the soft scrape of metal on wood. In this quiet moment, the architectural blueprints for American tactical secrecy are transferred. Soviet signals intelligence has just received the master key. And in the West, no alarm sounds. The breach is silent, total, and complete. The door to the next decade of covert warfare has been unlocked. The world of 1963 existed in a state of suspended tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis of the previous October had brought humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and then, with shuddering relief, stepped back. But the Cold War did not thaw. It mutated. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction made direct superpower conflict unthinkable. So the battle moved to the shadows, to proxy wars, to diplomacy, and above all, to intelligence. This was an era where information was a more critical currency than missiles. The ability to listen, to decode, to understand an adversary's plans without their knowledge was the ultimate strategic advantage. Signals intelligence, SIGINT, was the crown jewel of this shadow war. It was a global game of electronic cat and mouse, played by vast agencies like America's National Security Agency and the Soviet Union's KGB and GRU. Their targets were not just diplomatic cables, but military communications, the real-time orders, status reports, and logistical traffic that flowed between command posts and troops in the field. To protect these vital channels, the United States military relied on a combination of sophisticated radio equipment and encryption systems. The encryption was provided by machines and codebooks that scrambled voice and text into seemingly random noise. The security of the entire system, however, rested on two pillars: the physical security of the encryption devices themselves and the technical manuals that detailed their operation, maintenance, and most critically, their inherent electronic vulnerabilities. These manuals were classified as top secret. They were the DNA of American communications security. Into this high-stakes world walked Joseph E. Helmish. He was not a disillusioned ideologue, not a James Bond-style master spy. He was a technician, Army Signal Corps, assigned to the 8th Infantry Division in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany, and later to a communications site in Orléans, France. His job granted him an unglamorous but profound level of access. He was entrusted with the care and feeding of the very systems his nation depended on to keep its secrets: the AN/GRC-26 high-frequency radio sets and the associated encryption devices that scrambled the voices of generals and the orders for squadrons. Helmich's profile was that of a man vulnerable to a different kind of weapon: greed and personal grievance. By some accounts, he was frustrated with army life, burdened by financial debts, and enticed by the stories of a better, more prosperous life. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, with its sprawling network of agents and recruiters in Europe, was exquisitely tuned to detect such frequencies of discontent. They did not need to kidnap or blackmail a high-level officer. They needed a man with his hands on the machinery, a man who could be turned. The approach was likely gradual, professional, and mercenary. A pitch was made not for the soul, but for the wallet. The Soviets offered a simple, devastating transaction. Provide us with your knowledge, the documents you can access, and we will provide you with a new life, financial security, and a one-way passage out of your old one. For Helmich, the risk was existential, but the reward was tangible. He was not stealing battle plans for a single operation. He was preparing to hand over the foundational textbooks. Army's mail, not for a day, but for a generation. This was the slow-burning fuse that Helmich now carried. The quiet man in the communications hut was preparing to become the architect of one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the Cold War. His defection would not be a dramatic dash across the Berlin Wall. It would be a methodical, calculated act of betrayal, planned over months, executed with the cold precision of a technician. And on the other side, the Soviet machine was waiting, ready to receive a gift that would reshape the electronic battlefield for decades to come. On the other side of the ideological divide, the Soviet intelligence machine operated with a different philosophy, but an identical hunger. For the KGB's first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, and the GRU, Military Intelligence, the procurement of Western technical secrets was not a side operation. It was a central pillar of national strategy. The Soviet Union, often playing technological catch-up, viewed espionage as a vital shortcut, a force multiplier. Their targets were blueprints for jet engines, microprocessor designs, and the schematics of strategic defense systems. But among these prizes, Western cryptographic materials held a unique, almost mystical value. Breaking an enemy's codes was the Holy Grail. It offered a window into strategic thought and tactical intention with zero risk of exposure. The Soviets had a formidable mathematical and cryptanalytic tradition, but the complexity of modern American cipher systems, constantly evolving and built with cutting-edge electronics, presented a monumental challenge. A direct, brute force attack on these systems could take years if it succeeded at all. What they needed was a crib, a Rosetta Stone. They didn't necessarily need to steal the encryption machine itself, though that would be a bonus. What they truly required were the technical manuals. These documents, like TM11-380 for the AN GRC-26 radio set and TM11-285 for cryptographic maintenance, contained the system's deepest secrets. They detailed the radio's exact frequency ranges, its modulation methods, its power outputs, and its potential weak points where stray electronic signals, compromising emanations, might leak. More importantly, the crypto manuals explained the principles of operation, the keying procedures, the maintenance schedules, and the logical structure of the encryption algorithms. With these manuals in hand, Soviet cryptanalysts would not be working in the dark. They would have the manufacturer's specifications for the lock they were trying to pick. They could identify patterns, predict vulnerabilities, and build targeted interception equipment. Communication infrastructure in their own labs to experiment, to probe, and ultimately to break. The value was incalculable. It would potentially compromise every unit using that equipment, from the forests of Germany to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Army Europe in the early 1960s. Security, while strict on paper, was often grounded in a culture of trust and routine. Technical manuals, though classified, were working documents. They were used by sergeants and specialists in maintenance vans and signal shacks. The physical and procedural safeguards around them were designed to prevent accidental loss or casual theft, not to thwart a determined insider technician with time on his hands and a plan to defect. Intelligence community, while vigilant, was likely looking for threats in the wrong direction. Their focus was on the mole within the high councils of power, the ideologically driven traitor like a Philby or a Burgess. The concept of a low to mid-level enlisted man, motivated purely by personal gain, walking out with the crown jewels of tactical communications, may have been a blind spot. The system was built to guard against spies. It was less prepared for a heist. Thus, when Joseph Helmich made his decision, he was stepping into a vacuum. He was exploiting the gap between the monumental value of the information he held and the relative mundanity of his position. The Soviets, masters of spotting and exploiting systemic vulnerabilities, saw this gap clearly. They provided the means, the method, and the escape route. Helmich's defection was not an accident of history, but a predictable outcome of a relentless Soviet hunt for technical intelligence, meeting a perfectly susceptible target within a system that had underestimated the threat from within its own ranks. The transaction was set. The technician was ready to deliver, and in doing so, he would not just give away secrets, He would hand the Soviet Union a listening post inside the nervous system of the United States military. This establishes the strategic value of the manuals and the environment that made the breach possible. Joseph E. Helmich remains an opaque figure. He left behind no grand manifesto, no passionate letters justifying his treason. The historical record paints him in strokes of mundane avarice, not ideological fire. He was, by most accounts, a man of middling rank and ambition, ground down by the friction of military life. He carried personal debt, a weight that feels ordinary, human, but which in the context of the Cold War became a critical vulnerability. His role as a Signal Corps sergeant placed him in a unique psychological space. He was not a frontline soldier whose loyalty was forged in the adrenaline of combat. He was a custodian of machines. His world was one of oscilloscopes, circuit diagrams, and encrypted squawks from a speaker. This technical intimacy, paradoxically, might have bred a form of emotional distance. The systems he maintained were abstractions, complex puzzles to be solved, rather than direct instruments of his comrades' survival. Selling their secrets may not have felt in that moment like selling out individuals, but rather like transferring technical data. The KGB would have expertly nurtured this dissociation, framing the act as a victimless transaction between a knowledgeable technician and a grateful client. The mechanics of his recruitment are shrouded in the standard tradecraft of the era. It likely began with a honey trap, or a casual friendship engineered by a KGB operative in France or Germany. The relationship would have evolved slowly, with conversations subtly steering toward dissatisfaction, financial strain, and dreams of a different life. The offer, when it came, was not for a life of luxury, but for a life of ease and security. A powerful lure for a man feeling trapped. The Soviets were not buying a zealot, they were renting a technician. And Helmich, for his price, agreed to become a permanent asset. His defection was not a panicked flight, but a coldly executed operation. He did not simply snatch documents and run. He meticulously copied them, likely over a period of weeks or months, using microfilm cameras provided by his handlers. This required routine, nerve, and a sustained commitment to betrayal. Every time he threaded a new page into the camera's grip, he was making a conscious choice, reinforcing his new identity as Agent Dye, his KGB cryptonym. The man who carried out this systematic theft was not a passive victim of coercion. He was an active, calculating participant. Yet to view him purely as a mercenary is to oversimplify. There must have been moments of profound isolation, of silent terror, as he crossed the point of no return. The weight of his action, the understanding that he was irrevocably severing himself from his nation, his identity, his entire previous life would have been crushing. The Soviets would have managed this too, promising a seamless transition, a new home, a new persona. But the man who boarded the transport to the east was leaving Joseph Helmich behind. He was trading a known dissatisfaction for an unimaginable future, a gilded cage of his own making. His motivation may have been simple greed, but the psychological cost was a complex currency, one he would spend for the rest of his life in the strange, watchful paradise of the Soviet Union. He was a traitor, yes, but he was also a profoundly human warning, a testament to how the most formidable security architectures can be undone, not by genius, but by mundane human frailty. A ledger of debts, a bruised ego, a whispered promise of escape. The physical items Helmich microfilmed were not glamorous. S-Army technical manuals, TMs, bound in utilitarian covers, filled with schematics, wiring diagrams, and step-by-step procedures. To the untrained eye, they were impenetrable technical drudgery. To Soviet signals intelligence analysts, they were a revealed scripture. The crown jewel was Technical Manual TM 11380, covering the AN-GRC-26 radio set. This was not a simple walkie-talkie. S-Army divisional and corps-level command communications in the field. It provided reliable long-range voice and Morse code capability, the kind used to coordinate artillery, maneuver battalions, and air support. The manual contained its complete electronic blueprint, its precise frequency generation circuits, its power amplifier specifications, its receiver sensitivity curves. With this, Soviet electronic warfare units could now build optimized jammers targeting the GRC-26's exact frequency bands and modulation characteristics. More insidiously, they could design ultra-sensitive intercept receivers to pluck its transmissions from the ether with perfect clarity, knowing exactly where in the radio spectrum to listen and how to tune for the clearest signal. But the radio was only the conduit. The true heart of the secret was the encryption device that sat between the radio and the operator's handset. This is where Technical Manual TM 11-2285 and its associated cryptographic documents came in. These manuals dealt with the maintenance and operation of the encryption systems themselves, devices with names like the KY8 and associated Nestor keying material. They did not necessarily provide the daily changing cipher keys, but they provided something far more enduring: the complete architectural logic of the encryption machine. They detailed how the machine scrambled the voice using complex electronic permutations. They revealed its frame structure, how it organized the digital representation of speech. They listed its operational modes, its error conditions, and most critically, its potential weaknesses. In cryptography, a system is only as strong as its most subtle flaw: a mathematical bias in the key generator, a predictable pattern in the initialization, an electronic side channel where information leaks through power consumption or radio frequency emissions. These manuals were a guided tour of those potential flaws, written by the engineers who built the system. For Soviet cryptanalysts at institutes like the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate or the GRU's Special Service, this was the equivalent of being given the answer sheet before the exam. They no longer had to treat the encrypted signal as a black box output to be attacked with pure mathematics. They now understood the machine creating the noise. They could build an exact replica in their labs, a clone, and experiment on it. They could subject it to sophisticated analytical attacks, feeding it known text and studying the output, searching for the deterministic patterns that all mechanical encryption, no matter how complex, inevitably possesses. The totality of the breach meant that every unit equipped with the AN-GRC-26 and its associated crypto, from the Fulda Gap to South Korea, was potentially compromised. Soviet listening posts ringing the borders of the Eastern Bloc could now retune their massive antenna arrays with surgical precision. The static-filled conversations of American battalion commanders, the encrypted logistics requests, the coded status reports, all of it was now flowing into Soviet ears with a new, devastating clarity. S-Command and Control turning a secure network into an open book for his new masters. This technical betrayal created a silent, widening crack in the foundation of Western security, a crack that would not remain confined to the European theatre for long. The operation to exfiltrate Joseph Helmick and his priceless cargo was a textbook demonstration of KGB classic tradecraft. It was a slow, patient ballet of deception, built on compartmentalization, false identities, and flawless logistics. Helmick was not a defector who sprinted to an embassy. He was a packaged asset, carefully extracted. His initial contact and handling were almost certainly managed by KGB illegals or trusted agents operating under non-official cover in Western Europe. These operatives lived as seemingly ordinary citizens, businessmen, students, journalists, their sole purpose to identify and cultivate targets like Helmick. The pitch would have been gradual, moving from friendly conversations to oblique offers of help, finally crystallizing into a concrete proposal: wealth and a new life in exchange for service. Once Helmick was rolled up or recruited, he was given a cryptonym, Agent Dye, severing his real identity from his intelligence file. The microfilming of the manuals was the operation's most delicate phase. Helmick would have been provided with a compact, concealable camera, likely a Soviet-made copy of a Western model, along with film cassettes and instructions. The copying had to be done in secret, likely during late hours in a secure maintenance area, or even off-base in a safe house. Each page of the dense manuals had to be carefully photographed, a process taking weeks. The film cassettes, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, were then passed to his handler during pre-arranged brush passes or dead drops, perhaps a hollowed-out rock in a park, a specific magazine left on a train station bench, or a brief exchange in a crowded cafe. Each successful handoff reinforced the operation's momentum and deepened Helmick's complicity. The final act, Helmick's physical defection, required meticulous planning. He could not simply disappear from his base. That would trigger an immediate alarm and a hunt for what he might have taken. Instead, the KGB likely engineered a scenario. He may have been granted leave, or his duties may have taken him near a border or to a neutral country. From there, a well-rehearsed sequence took over: false travel documents, a series of cutouts, intermediaries who knew only one link in the chain, and covert transportation, perhaps by ship from a non-aligned port or through a sympathetic third country, spirited him behind the Iron Curtain. His family in the United States was left behind, unaware. S-Army Sergeant Helmish was initially just another soldier who failed to return from leave, a possible deserter, not yet a catastrophic security breach. Upon arrival in the Soviet Union, Helmish entered the next phase of the intelligence life cycle: debriefing and resettlement. He was taken to a secure dacha outside Moscow, a comfortable but isolated facility. For months, a team of technical specialists from the KGB and GRU, alongside linguists and interrogators, would have worked through the microfilmed manuals page by page with him. His value was not just the documents, but his lived experience. How is this radio typically used in the field? What are its common failures? How do operators bypass security procedures for speed? This contextual knowledge turns static diagrams into dynamic intelligence. After the debriefing, Helmish was given a new identity, likely Joseph Gregory Brown or a similar Anglo-Saxon name, a modest apartment, a pension, and a monitored existence. He was a kept man, a high-value asset who needed to be both protected and watched. His knowledge had a half-life. As American equipment was updated, his direct utility would fade. But the foundational principles he revealed and the specific vulnerabilities of the 1960s generation gear would inform Soviet electronic warfare doctrine for years. The operation, codenamed and filed away in KGB archives, was a quiet, unqualified masterstroke. It left no bullet casings, no blown bridges, only a silent, bleeding wound in the side of American military secrecy. And as Helmish settled into his new, watched life in Moscow, the consequences of his choices began to ripple outward, far beyond the debriefing room walls. The impact of Helmich's betrayal did not announce itself with a thunderclap, but with a creeping, silent frost. For the Soviet signals, intelligence, and cryptographic services, the acquisition was an epical windfall. The GRC-26 manuals and associated crypto documents were immediately disseminated to specialized units: the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, Cryptography, the GRU's 6th Directorate, SIGINT, and the electronic warfare branches of the Soviet ground forces. Almost overnight, the Soviet Union's electronic order of battle against NATO transformed. Intercept stations along the inner German border, in the Caucasus Mountains aimed at Turkey and Iran, and in the Far East facing Japan and Korea were recalibrated. Their massive, steerable horsetail and pork chop antennas were now tuned with a jeweler's precision to the exact frequency ranges and emission characteristics of the AN-GRC-26. What was once a haystack of radio noise became a neatly organized field of specific, high-value signals. The cryptographic breach was even more profound. As encryption devices laid bare, Soviet cryptanalysts could shift from theoretical attacks to applied reverse engineering. They began building analog and, later, digital models of the systems. While breaking the day-to-day cipher keys still required immense computational effort, the manuals provided a monumental shortcut. They revealed the choke points, the mathematical or procedural vulnerabilities where the system's randomness might be weakest. It allowed them to develop targeted, differential, or linear cryptanalysis techniques specific to that hardware. The time to decrypt intercepted traffic collapsed from an impractical eternity to a potentially actionable timeline, days or weeks, instead of years. S-Army Europe's posture. Training exercises, previously opaque, now revealed their patterns and communication signatures. Unit rotations, logistical bottlenecks, and even the procedural chatter of daily operations became intelligible. This intelligence fed directly into Warsaw Pact war planning, allowing for more precise targeting of command nodes, logistics hubs, and communication centers in the event of a conflict. The Soviet concept of radio-electronic combat, REC, the integrated suppression of enemy C3I, command, control, communications, and intelligence, received a massive, unearned boost. They could now design jammers that didn't just blanket frequencies, but that specifically mimicked or disrupted the GRC-26's modulation, a far more efficient and debilitating tactic. For NATO, the effect was a slow, rolling paralysis they could not yet diagnose. Secure communications are the nervous system of an alliance. Commanders began to operate under an unspoken, gnawing suspicion. Were their movements predictable? Was the enemy anticipating their exercises with uncanny accuracy? A fog of doubt descended, not over the battlefield, but over the very channels meant to dispel it. the United States would eventually be forced to initiate a costly, urgent program to replace the compromised systems, a process that would take years and billions of dollars. But in the immediate aftermath of 1963, the advantage had decisively and silently shifted eastward. S-forces used their standard, issued equipment according to their manuals the more they were broadcasting their intentions to a predetermined audience in Moscow. Helmich's treason had turned their most vital tool into a potential instrument of their own deception. And this compromised technology, now understood and mastered by the Soviets, would not remain in a European vault. It would be exported, replicated, and its countermeasures applied in a very different, hotter war a decade and a half later, a war of burning helicopters and mountain ambushes, where the same principles of radio and crypto would decide life and death. The turning point was not a single event, but a dawning. It was the slow, chilling accumulation of anomalies that hardened into a terrifying certainty. For years after Helmich's disappearance, the full scale of the disaster remained hidden from Western intelligence. Army roles as a deserter, a personnel issue, not a counterintelligence crater. But in the shadows of the intelligence world, puzzling fragments began to surface. The first hints likely came from signals intelligence on the other side. Issy Sigint of the Sigint Hunters. American and British listening posts monitoring Soviet and Warsaw Pact communications might have detected a shift. Intercepted transmissions between Soviet intercept stations could have shown new, precise frequency designators matching the GRC-26 bands, procedures with a fidelity that went beyond skilled guesswork. Simultaneously, human intelligence, HUMINT, streams began to trickle with disturbing clues. Defectors from the Eastern Bloc, or perhaps agents in place within the Soviet scientific technical bureaucracy, relayed whispers of a major intelligence coup. Vague reports spoke of a windfall in American communications technology, a complete set of manuals that was the subject of intense study at a GRU technical institute outside Moscow. The puzzle pieces were scattered, and their picture was monstrous. The breakthrough, when it came, almost certainly stemmed from a positive identification of Helmich himself. This could have originated from a sighting by a Western diplomat or journalist in Moscow, a blurred photo of a man resembling the missing sergeant in a controlled Soviet housing complex, or, more decisively, it may have come from a high-level Soviet source. A mole within the KGB or GRU, such as Oleg Penkovsky, though his time was nearly up, or later assets like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen, could have provided a definitive report. The Americans had lost their entire GRC-26 and associated crypto system to an army sergeant who was now living under protection in the USSR. The moment this intelligence reached the desk of the CIA's counterintelligence chief or the NSA's director was the true climax. It was a silent, office-bound catastrophe. The reports would have been cross-referenced: Helmich's access, his disappearance timeline, the Soviet technical intelligence gains, the anomalous SIGINT data. The pattern locked into place with a terrible logical finality. S-field communications on a platter. The immediate reaction was a controlled professional panic, shrouded in absolute secrecy. To publicly acknowledge the breach would be to admit the scale of the failure and confirm the value of the intelligence to the Soviets, potentially causing even more damage by revealing what they knew. Instead, a series of classified, urgent directives, stamped with the highest priority, went out from the Pentagon and Fort Meade. A crash program was initiated to assess the damage and formulate a response. Every unit using the compromised systems had to be considered potentially exposed. War plans, particularly the detailed NATO defense plans for Europe, Reforger, were now suspect. The very fabric of command and control had to be rewoven under the assumption that the enemy was listening to every thread. This was the turning point, the shift from secret advantage to known vulnerability. The United States was now forced to fight the next phase of the Cold War on an electronic battlefield where the enemy, thanks to a single sergeant's avarice, held a detailed map of their defenses. The race was on. A race to replace, to innovate, to outpace the knowledge Helmich had sold. But technology moves slowly and wars can start quickly. The shadow of his betrayal now loomed over every future confrontation, a debt that would come due with terrible interest in mountains far from the plains of Central Europe. Confirmation crystallized in the mid to late 1960s. The evidence, pieced together from Humint and Sigint, became incontrovertible. He was a ghost who had been found, and in finding him, the West confirmed its own haunting. The realization that followed was an operational nightmare of recursive paranoia. The question was no longer if the Soviets had the manuals, but how deeply they had exploited them. Every encrypted transmission sent over the compromised systems for the past several years had to be re-evaluated. Were Soviet analysts at that very moment reading back transcripts of conversations from the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis aftermath, or the escalating operations in Vietnam? Had tactical decisions, force movements, or diplomatic positions been anticipated because a secure line was, in fact, a broadcasting studio for the Kremlin? Cryptographic doctrine. The principle of security through obscurity was now a proven corpse. The system's security could no longer rely on the secrecy of its design, for that design was in enemy hands. The urgent push began for mathematically pure, computer-driven encryption that relied on computational complexity rather than hidden mechanics, the seeds of what would become modern public key cryptography. But that was a future solution. For the present, the immediate fix was logistical and gargantuan. The wholesale replacement of hardware and the reissuing of keying material to thousands of units worldwide. It was a silent, multi-billion-dollar emergency. Attacks on national security paid because of one man's defection. The psychological impact on the intelligence and military community was profound. It was a stark lesson in asymmetric vulnerability. A multi-billion-dollar defense infrastructure could be critically wounded not by a missile, but by a microfilm camera in the hands of a disgruntled sergeant. Security protocols were brutally overhauled. Access to cryptographic materials was tightened dramatically. The culture of trust within technical units was inevitably tempered by a new layer of systemic suspicion. Vetting procedures for personnel with sensitive access were intensified, giving birth to more rigorous polygraph and lifestyle monitoring programs. For the Soviets, this period was one of quiet, confident exploitation. Helmic's information had a long shelf life. Military technology, especially at the tactical level, evolved slowly. And Allied inventories for years, even decades, particularly with smaller allies and secondary units. Furthermore, the principles learned were timeless. Engineered its secure communications in the 1960s, gave Soviet scientists a blueprint of American engineering philosophy, a pattern of thought they could apply to analyzing the next generation and the next. The climax of Helmic's story, therefore, is not a battle won or lost in a day. It is the moment the Western alliance internally acknowledged it had been fighting blindfolded for years, and that the blindfold had been tied by its own hand. The turning point was the realization that the war in the shadows had just been irrevocably tilted, and that regaining balance would require not just new codes, but a new understanding of enemy. A lesson written not in battle reports, but in the static of compromised radios. This silent, electronic front of the Cold War was now definitively lost, and the consequences would echo forward, finding tragic, tangible expression in the next major proxy conflict, where these technologies were put to the ultimate test. The direct aftermath was a silent, sprawling salvage operation. S-Army and NATO, a two-pronged effort began: damage mitigation and systemic replacement. The compromised AN/GRC-26 sets and their associated encryption gear could not be instantly scrapped. They were too widespread, too embedded in the force structure. Instead, they were gradually phased out from frontline, high-priority units in Central Europe. These units received newer systems like the eventual SINGARS radios and more advanced encryption devices in a frantic attempt to stay ahead of the Soviet advantage. For units still using the old gear, operating procedures were radically altered. Frequency-hopping spread spectrum technology, which had been in its infancy, was fast-tracked. Reliance on the compromised systems was minimized, with increased use of landlines, couriers, and emergent satellite communications for the most sensitive traffic. It was a cumbersome, costly retreat into less efficient methods, attacks on operational tempo paid for by Helmic's treason. For Joseph Helmich himself, life in the Soviet Union settled into the predictable pattern of a high-value defector. He was given a modest state pension, an apartment, and a monitored existence. He was not a celebrity like the later defector Lee Harvey Oswald might have been. He was a technical asset whose primary value had been spent. He lived a life of quiet obscurity, a man who had traded his past for a gilded cage, forever looking over his shoulder, not for American pursuers, but for the minders of his protectors, who were also his jailers. He reportedly worked as a translator and consultant, his specialized knowledge slowly becoming obsolete. He died in Moscow in 2007, his obituary a footnote in the West, a closed file in the East. But the hardware and principles he betrayed did not die with him. S-Military cycled out its older equipment. That equipment found new life. Through military assistance programs, MAP, thousands of AN/GRC-26 radio sets and their contemporary encryption devices were supplied to American allies across the globe. They were sent to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, and most consequentially to the Kingdom of Afghanistan, and later to the Afghan army loyal to the Soviet-backed Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA, in the late 1970s. This transfer set the stage for a devastating historical irony. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, they were not entering a technologically unknown environment. Their own forces were equipped with modern Soviet gear, but their client state, the DRA army they were meant to support, and the various militias they fought against were often using older generation equipment. And thanks to Helmish, the Soviet Spetsnaz, signals intelligence troops and GRU advisors who flooded into Afghanistan, carried with them a deep institutional memory. They had spent nearly 2 decades studying the technical manuals for the very American radio and crypto systems that were now in the hands of their enemy. The Soviet 40th Army's signals intelligence branches, the OSNAS units, set up intercept stations in Kabul, Bagram, and major garrisons. Their scanning protocols, their jamming profiles, their very understanding of how to listen were partially built on the foundation laid by Helmich's microfilm. When they heard the distinct modulation of an AN/GRC-26 on the air, it was not an unknown signal. It was a familiar one. They knew its range, its power profiles, its likely vulnerabilities. This gave them an immediate and significant advantage in locating and targeting the communications hubs of the DRA's opponents in the early stages of the war. Yet the ultimate tragedy and the full, grotesque circle of the aftermath was yet to be closed. For the United States, in response to the Soviet invasion, would soon activate a massive program to arm the Mujahideen resistance. And in doing so, they would unwittingly complete the circuit of betrayal, supplying weapons and technology that played directly into the Soviet Union's oldest and most illegally acquired intelligence strengths. The CIA's covert action program to support the Afghan Mujahideen, authorized by President Carter and vastly expanded under President Reagan, was an operation of immense scale and complexity. Its goal was to bleed the Soviet Union, and to do so, it required equipping a guerrilla force with the tools of modern warfare. Alongside Stinger missiles and AK-47s, secure communications were a critical need. The Mujahideen needed to coordinate ambushes, report Soviet movements, and receive instructions from their Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) handlers. The equipment funneled through the pipeline was, by necessity, robust, available, and deniable. S and allied gear. Among this material were secure communications sets. And here the cruelest twist of the Helmich saga unfolded. Some of the equipment supplied, or its logical derivatives and copies, included technology conceptually similar to that compromised in 1963. While not necessarily the exact AN/GRC-26, the system shared foundational principles of high-frequency HF, transmission and encryption, that the Soviets had spent 2 decades mastering, thanks to Helmich's manuals. Furthermore, the ISI and CIA trained Mujahideen signalers in cryptographic procedures. The Soviets, with their deep background knowledge, were often listening. According to declassified accounts and analyses from veterans of the Soviet Signals Intelligence Forces, the OSNAS units in Afghanistan achieved significant successes intercepting and decrypting Mujahideen communications. They were not breaking unbreakable modern ciphers. They were often exploiting the limitations and procedural flaws in older generation field-expedient secure communications, the vulnerabilities of which were part of the family tree whose roots Helmich had exposed. This intelligence was acted upon with brutal efficiency. Intercepted communications allowed the Soviet 40th Army and KGB Spetsnaz units to pinpoint guerrilla headquarters, staging areas, and supply columns. They enabled devastatingly precise artillery and aerial bombardments, often hitting targets just after a radio transmission ceased. The infamous Mujahideen ambush turned into a Soviet trap was a recurring nightmare made possible not just by informants, but by the electronic fingerprint of a radio set. The human cost of this secondary betrayal is incalculable. Mujahideen fighters, relying on what they were told was secure equipment provided by their powerful ally, were instead broadcasting their positions to the very enemy they sought to destroy. A Stinger missile team could be located not by its heat signature, but by its routine radio check-in. A supply caravan coordinated over the airwaves could be annihilated from the skies. The Soviets' proficiency in this realm was a silent, lethal force multiplier throughout the conflict, a ghost in the machine that was a direct progeny of Joseph Helmich's Defection. Thus, the aftermath of a treason committed in 1963 reached its full, tragic maturity in the Hindu Kush in the 1980s. An American sergeant's greed for a better life indirectly contributed to the deaths of those the United States was supporting a generation later. It was a stark lesson in the long shelf life of intelligence and the unforgiving law of unintended consequences in covert warfare. Supplied forces, creating a battlefield where one side often understood the other's communications technology better than its users did. The breach forced a fundamental evolution. The disaster of the Helmich Compromise directly contributed to the relentless American drive for cryptological supremacy via unbreakable mathematical algorithms and eventually quantum-resistant encryption. It underscored that in the modern age, the soldier with the cipher is as crucial as the soldier with the rifle, and that betrayal in the technical realm can have a longer, bloodier half-life than any act of traditional sabotage. The war in Afghanistan ended for the Soviets in 1989, but the silent war over the electromagnetic spectrum, whose course Helmich altered, would rage on indefinitely. The story of Joseph Helmich is not one of grand battles, but of silent vectors. It measures the distance between a minor personal grievance and a global seismic shift in security. It traces the arc of a single mundane betrayal as it travelled through time, from a safe house in Moscow to the desks of Soviet cryptanalysts to the sun-baked hills of Afghanistan, where it found its final, lethal expression in intercepted transmissions and sudden, violent death from the sky. This narrative exposes a central paradox of the modern technological age. The most formidable fortresses are no longer made of stone and steel, but of ideas and algorithms. Yet their weakest point remains irreducibly human. A system engineered to withstand the collective intellectual assault of a superpower could be undone by the simple, selfish desires of one man entrusted with its care. Helmich did not crack a code, he simply opened a door. And in doing so, he demonstrated that in the shadow war of intelligence, the human factor is the ultimate variable, the perennial vulnerability that no amount of engineering can fully erase. The long echo of his treason, reverberating from Europe to Afghanistan, serves as a grim lesson in the enduring toxicity of compromised secrets. In intelligence, there are no isolated events. A secret sold becomes a weapon that changes hands, a latent virus that can infect conflicts far removed in time and geography. The tools provided to the Mujahideen were meant to liberate, but a ghost in their circuitry, born of a 1963 defection, sometimes turned them into beacons for their own destruction. Ultimately, the Helmich case forces a cold reflection on the nature of trust and the price of neglect. It stands as a monument to the fact that the guardians of a nation's most sensitive secrets are not always generals or statesmen in secure rooms. They are often ordinary individuals in unremarkable places, performing routine tasks. Their loyalty, their contentment, their sense of value become matters of paramount national security. The silence that followed Helmich's defection was not peace. It was the sound of a door closing on a vault that was already empty. And in that quiet, the landscape of the Cold War was irrevocably altered, proving that the most decisive turns of history can hinge not on the roar of a cannon, but on the quiet click of a microfilm camera advancing to the next frame.